All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Bernie Sanders made a pretty interesting appearance yesterday on MSNBC with Stephanie Ruhle, where for the first time he did express a little bit of dismay at Joe's approach to the young folks and working class folks who formed the basis of Bernie's campaign. Let's take a listen.
I think there is an excellent chance that Biden is going to win. But in order to guarantee that, he is going to have to reach out to working class people and young people in a way that he has not done up to now. And he is going to have to make it clear. He stands with a working class in this country that is struggling right now. He is prepared to take on the corporate elite and the big money interest in order to create an economy that works for all, not just the few.
Now, that very mild critique was nice to hear. Of course, as you heard in my critique earlier this week, I think Bernie had a chance to push Biden to do more outreach to these groups, but ultimately the responsibility does lie with Biden. I think it's entirely likely he doesn't really care to reach out to the young, working class, and disproportionately Latino voters who backed Bernie because he doesn't think he needs them. He won the primary without them. He's leading Trump significantly right now without having done jack to reach out to them. They have, in his view, no other good options. He might be correct, honestly. Seniors are falling for Joe, and Trump is doing his level best to hand the election to him. But, Hillary suffered from a whole lot of arrogance around who would show up for her and why. So if Trump is really an existential threat, you'd think you'd better be scraping and clawing for every last vote you can get. Not to mention if you care about actually keeping young voters and the Bernie left inside the Democratic tent. Convincing gullible journalists that you're the next FDR and putting together some fake task forces, it's not going to cut it. Now, as they say, personnel is policy. And so as we look for signs of how Biden might actually approach the left, the normal starting point is to look at likely VP and cabinet appointments. Of course, the news has been dismal on the cabinet appointment front as Biden has repeatedly spoken of being a bridge to the Mayor Petes of the world. That's to say nothing of floating Jamie Dimon for Treasury Secretary and taking advice from Larry Summers. But we can also look to the here and now. Biden is staffing up on his campaign right now, bringing on the operatives who will set the strategy on both operational tactics and policy. So who is he bringing on board? What has the outreach been like to the team that very nearly bested him? Because yes, Bernie did lose. But by every metric of fundraising, enthusiasm, and organizing, he ran a vastly superior campaign operation. Yes, of course, they were hobbled by some strategic mistakes that we have discussed here quite a bit. But surely there were areas to learn from. For one example, you'll recall that during the Iowa caucuses, Pete Buttigieg held a slight edge on Bernie Sanders in that Byzantine state delegate equivalence metric, as often inaccurate results trickled in over days. But as the final overwhelmingly immigrant satellite caucus sites were added to the totals, Bernie started to close in fast. In the end, Iowa revealed both flaws and strengths in Bernie's strategy. But the one bright shining spot in Iowa, as it was in Nevada and in California, and frankly consistently in national polls, was Bernie's success with Latino voters. In Iowa, Bernie won nearly unanimously at the state's Spanish language caucus sites. In Nevada, he absolutely dominated with Latinos on the way to a major victory. Of course, risers knew that this was a key part of the Bernie strategy because we've been talking for months to the architect of that strategy, Chuck Rocha. So you would think that since Democrats in the Biden camp see Trump as a republic-ending civilizational threat, they would maybe try to reach out to Chuck, try to find out what he did, maybe even bring him on board to help guide the campaign's Latino approach. But as Chuck told us here, and as I confirmed with him yesterday, no such outreach has occurred. They haven't tried to hire him and haven't even reached out for a conversation about how he built such a successful model of outreach to a community that Democrats have been trying to strategically cultivate for years. It's not just Chuck, though. I asked Bernie campaign manager Faz Shakir about any staffing outreach, and he told me that while there had been plans for Team Biden to bring on some organizing and advanced staff, those plans were stuck since the campaign had gone into coronavirus stall. Meanwhile, some staffing announcements have been made, including a few high-profile ones this week. The Biden camp announced the hiring of Obama alums Julie Chavez Rodriguez and Karine Jean-Pierre. Rodriguez served as co-national political director for Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. Jean-Pierre was chief public affairs officer at MoveOn and is also an MSNBC political analyst. Biden's team is clearly wanting to make a statement by hiring two high-level women of color who at least call themselves progressive. But even this Kamala Liz type of progressive only honestly seems to have one foot in the door in Biden world. Neither Julie nor Karine have fully left their previous positions. Has literally anyone been hired by the Biden camp from Bernie world? Not according to press reports and not according to all the folks who I spoke with. Not one. Look, I'm not surprised, but it's easy to take for granted the fact that a quite significant chunk of the Democratic electorate would be utterly scorned and unrepresented, that people wouldn't even think to hope that there might be a Bernie World VP or cabinet pick in a Biden administration, that this contempt and commitment to quashing the left extends all the way down to the staffing levels should show you just how serious they are about the project of crushing this entire, again, rather large portion of the Democratic base, a desire that we've seen at all levels of the Democratic establishment, even if it means turning off an entire generation, maybe 2 generations. Even if it means risking a loss to the man that they claim to so passionately resist. Snuffing out the Bernie left was always priority number 1. If they can beat Trump while they're at it, so much the better. And Sagar, it really is amazing, and you might want to just chalk it up to incompetence. Certainly possible.
Well, yes.
But when you think about not just Joe Biden, but the way that Pelosi and everyone else has gone overboard trying to crush every semblance of any kind of dissent from the left of the party, it becomes clear, this is the number 1 project. And we saw this during the primary. The number 1 goal was always to defeat Bernie Sanders. If you can beat Donald Trump while you're at it, great, that's terrific. But they actually do see Bernie as a more existential threat, even though ultimately, look, we're going to cover later in the show, now he's muzzling his delegates, telling them they can't criticize. It was not the, threat and revolutionary that maybe we would have hoped he would be. But they still see him as that. Any threat, even Elizabeth Warren type progressive, is too outlandish.
That's actually the key. They can't handle even an ounce of past criticism, not even an ounce of past dissent, and they don't grant any legitimacy. Look, part of when you win is you're supposed to coalesce the party. This is actually, Trump was very good at this.
Yeah.
After he won, reached all the he brought the RNC.
After
everybody.
how ugly that primary was.
What you do is, it's exactly what you do. It's you absolutely vilify them. After you beat them, shake their hands, smile. It's all good. Welcome to get on the bus. That's really what that's how political coalitions.
The Pence choice was all about shoring up the religious right and giving them comfort and making sure they felt like their voice was at the table.
Even Marco Rubio spoke at the national convention, had that video. Ted Cruz was the only person who really wouldn't jump on until he did near the very end. And it's just so telling that these are the types of people that they hire. By the way, Jean-Pierre once said that nobody should ever work for a candidate who'd been accused of sexual assault, credibly accused of sexual assault.
Oh, really? I missed that.
Guess you forgot about that one whenever she decided to go work for the Biden campaign.
Interesting note.
But you can just go and you can see how the way that the staffing is being done now, everybody should understand this. The people who work on the campaign are the ones who get the plum West Wing appointments. That's just how it works, right?
Yeah.
You were there in the trenches, then you become counselor to the president. There's not that many of these positions available, maybe 100, 150 directly inside the West Wing that go direct access to the president of the United States. You are getting a very clear glimpse of what that's going to look like. People like Simone Sanders, people like Jean-Pierre, the Kamala Harris person that you pointed out, Ron Klain will probably be his chief of staff. We know the ideology of these people. In many ways, the ideology of the chief executive doesn't mean anything if the rest of the staff is not garnered around whatever the ideology is. You see that right now with the Trump administration. You could see that with the Obama administration. With all of these people, it's it matters so much more who the top 100, 200 people in the government and the way that they exercise power, how they know to exercise power, how they think about politics.
Yeah.
And the fact that they even refuse to bring in anybody from the number 2, the runner-up in the Democratic primary.
Yeah, by every metric, obviously Joe beat Bernie. But he was 3 days from being the nominee. In terms of campaign organization, bested him on every front. Enthusiasm, fundraising, everything, right? So to say they just lost, so there's nothing to learn there. But you're bringing in Kamala people, so tell me about that. But I do think it is it really exposes, not that we're surprised that the task forces are just placating window dressing, right? We know that. But it really sort of exposes what the real project of the task forces is. It's a way of symbolically pretending to reach out to this part of the coalition without actually putting them in a position of any power. Even the low-level power of a staffer is too much. So you put them on this task force for show, right? And then who you staff up with right now, certainly who you put in your administration, none of these people are going to be involved in the administration. It's just purely a way of pretending, of cosplaying outreach to the left. And when you see, again, literally not one person from the second place campaign. And again, it's easy to just be like, well, of course they're not going to reach out, but you shouldn't take that for granted because that is very unusual in the history of Democratic and Republican politics. It is not the norm for what you do.
No, it's certainly not. It's an intentional choice, and everybody should remember that.
Next on Rising, sanitation workers remain on strike in New Orleans. Friend of the show, Nina Turner, explains why when Rising returns.